Hello my dear sewing friends, it's Alisa here, and in this particular video you are going to see not only quite a lot of sewing makes, but also 6 full episodes from Sew Easy Season 2 all combined in one place. Now when I did this type of compilation video for Sew Easy Season 1, I did it in the chronological order, so episodes as they were released. But this time, let's do it in a slightly different way because right now here in Northern Hemisphere, as of the filming of this video, it's winter time. So let's start with more weather appropriate sewing makes so that way you can get inspired and hopefully get sewing as well. I want to begin with the cuddliest, softest, and probably one of the easiest garments to sew in this entire lineup. It's a little two-piece, but you can also just make it as is. And I think it's really easy in construction and pattern drafting, partially because we do it right on the body, so it really takes confusion out of it. It gets really visual and therefore really simple. So let's get going. As you can see from the sketch, the garment itself is really easy and really straightforward. Basically, we have 3 pattern pieces, right? We have the front, the back, and the neckline, and that's about it. So if you want to create something very similar, I'm sure that you will have no trouble whatsoever. And I know that sometimes when we talk about simple or really straightforward garments, we tend to think about them as boring, but I always urge you to look beyond the line drawings and look beyond the pattern and see the possibilities. So at the very end of this video, I'm going to style this in a couple of different ways, the way that I see wearing it, and hopefully that will inspire you. But right now, let's get to it. Now the plan is actually basic, and for my first step, I'm going to start with a rectangle and then adjust it on my body for the final shape. To get the measurements for the rectangles, I see 2 very simple ways how we can go about it. Now first, since this is a drop shoulder garment, imagine that there are 2 arms over here. We can take our measuring tape and we can measure from one drop shoulder to the other drop shoulder and take that as the approximate measurement of the top side of the rectangle, and then find your high point shoulder and measure all the way down to however long you want your garment to be. In this case, you will need to make sure that the width of the rectangle has enough ease to go over your bust, your waist, and to go over on top of another garment, depending on the fabric that you're using, meaning stretch or no stretch. Now, in my case, this is going to be a very relaxed fit garment, so there should be quite a bit of ease to create that volume that I'm looking for. But you might go for a more form-fitting version, so it really depends on you. Just keep these things in mind. Option number 2 would be to take your largest circumference, so bust, waist, or hips if you want your garment to go past your hips. So let's say in this case we have bust as the largest circumference, and that is 35. We will need to divide that by 2 because we have one front pattern piece and one back pattern piece, so 17.5 in this case, and then we need to add a ton of ease to it. So let's say I want to add 10 inches, so 17.5 plus 10 inches would be 27.5. And then we can sort of drape it over our shoulders and see if that drop shoulder is something that we're going for, or perhaps we need to increase a little bit more. Needless to say that we will need to add seam allowances and hem allowances to these measurements. For example, this double-sided faux sherpa that I'm using for this project takes an inch in order to do just a simple double fold hem, which I'm going to do by hand, by the way, because I do feel that it gives a cleaner, neater result. And speaking of fabric, I'm going for a volume, fuzz, fluff. So as I mentioned, I'm using this double-sided sherpa, thick textile, definitely creates that volume. If you want the same, you can go for a really chunky knit, maybe some faux fur. If you want less volume, you can go for French terry or jersey, or even double brush polyester, perhaps some wool, fleece, so many different textiles that you can opt for. Just definitely think of how you're going to wear this. For my own measurements, I simply folded the entire fabric that I had in half, and it gave me 28.5 inches, and I think I can work with that. So we're just going to cut one side as 28.5 inches, and the other side is going to be about 22 inches or so. And I also folded my fabric so that way the selvage ends are on the bottom, because I want to use that instead of a hem, and I quite like that. They're not going to unravel, so that's what I'm doing here. Now I just gotta cut this out, and once done, I'm going to adjust it on my body. my rectangles, I'm going to fold them in half, and I'm going to mark the center front and center back. And I'm going to use those markings as sort of like a guideline for me to cut two very shallow necklines. Shallow is the key word because we can always make them deeper, but for right now, I just need to know where those necklines are at as we're going to baste this together. So I think I'm going to cut my back neckline 1 inch deep and the front neckline 2 inches deep, and that should do it. For the width of the neckline, you can just use a very basic t-shirt that you already have and copy the measurements from there. Just don't forget to add your seam allowances. Now I'm going to place the front and the back right sides together and baste the shoulder seams and the side seams. And after that, I will try it on and make the final adjustments right on my body. And one of the reasons why I want to go this route today is because this is such a simple project, so I feel that whatever I'm trying to say by doing this example is not going to be lost in the process. And what I'm trying to say is that a lot of times we feel that there's some sort of pattern drafting police or sewing police, but in reality, there are many ways how to draft patterns, there are many ways how to sew, there are many schools of thoughts and approaches, and you are the boss because you are the one who is creating the pattern, the clothes, your visions that come to mind and come to life. And I feel that once you realize the power that you hold as the person who is expressing their creativity and is the one sewing and creating, once you realize that power, you can do anything and anyhow as long as the final result fits well and you're happy with your creation. Now let's turn it out and see what we've got. And man, the fuzz from the fabric is absolutely everywhere. And as expected, I definitely want to adjust the shoulder slope, so I'm going to measure and pin while the garment is still on me. So the first adjustment that I'm going to do is the shoulder slope, and I have determined that I need to lower it by about 4.5 inches. So basically like this instead of that. And we knew that that's going to happen, so this is going to be the first step. Need to cut away this part, don't forget about the seam allowances, and then baste it back together and repeat it on the other side. Now while I'm at it, I also need to deepen this opening a little bit, just by about 1 inch or so, and I need to sort out this angle so that way when I wear it, the sleeve hangs right. So I need to make it almost a 90-degree angle right over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut, and from here I'm going to take it straight all the way down to the hem. And I know that my garment right now has plenty of ease, so cutting away this much on both sides of the garment is going to be just fine. Alright, now that that is done, it's time to baste it and try it on one more time before the final stage. Alright, not too bad, so we are almost there. Now I will do two final adjustments. First, I'm going to create a slightly more pronounced sleeve so that way I can fold the hem without a problem. And second, I'm going to deepen the front neckline. And after this, we are ready to sew. First will be the shoulder seams. And here, I actually have decided that I want to serge the sleeve hem as well. So that way I can actually do a single fold hem instead the double fold that I initially thought I would do and avoid it being super thick. I also did the same on the neckline, and for the next step I placed and sewed the side seams right sides together. Now from here I just have to simply finish sleeve and neckline openings by hand, and I know that a lot of people really dislike hand sewing, but fluffy fabric like this is your best friend at it as it hides the stitches so well. Now under the supervision of Kitty Eva, I folded all of the hems once to the wrong side, threaded hand sewing needle, and got to work. By now, you're probably wondering, wait a second, how about the original neckline? Well, it turns out I actually had enough fabric left and I decided to do a scarf neckline, so that way I can wear it together or separately, sort of like a 2-in-1. As you have guessed, it is also just a rectangle big enough to go over your head in a circle, and sewing steps are exactly the same as if you would sew a scrunchie, minus the elastic of course. So first I placed the long sides, right sides together and sewed those, leaving about 2 to 3 inches open on both sides. Now once done, I am going to tube it through so that way I can sew the short ends. That will leave us with a little opening to turn the scarf right side out. And as you have gathered, I will close up the opening with hand sewing stitches. Now let's take a look at the final result. Now from here, you can really take it in any direction that you would like. And I would really love to encourage you to think it in a variety of different ways. For example, you can make it a little bit longer, turn it into a tunic. Make it a little bit longer than tunic, turn it into a dress. You can also add side seam pockets from there, or perhaps one big pocket right here, kangaroo pocket at the center. You could also add closures, for example, buttons down the center front, or a zipper, or scoot it a little bit to one side and make it asymmetrical so you get a closure which is functional and also a design element. And I truly hope that a really simple pattern drafting project like this could get you going and help you make all of your sewing and design dreams come true. Next, let's take a look at a really versatile piece for winter, spring, and fall weather, and that is a cardigan. It's very easy, very straightforward, but very much needed in my wardrobe. And I think this is also very on trend because I see these everywhere. Now here we have a very slight drop shoulder, quite a big sleeve, but that's on sketch. Maybe I'll go with the bishop sleeve, maybe I'll do just a regular sleeve. I'm gonna think about that. Remember, we're embracing our own designer, so we can do whatever our heart desires, right? And then we have a couple of buttons down the center front, so it's a functioning button placket, so we need to account for that. And it's quite cropped, but again, that's on sketch because I must say that cropped length doesn't necessarily suit me, neither does anything high-waisted. It always kind of looks a little awkward on me and uncomfortable, so you can do whatever length you would like. You can really make it cropped. I think I will make it sort of this length where it just reaches a little bit over past where my jeans or my pants will start. Let's cover the basis of what we're going to be using in order to make pattern adjustments, and then I'll show you some of the fabric. I got my big binder over here, and I will be using knit bodice block sweater adjustment. That is from my knit bodice block series. I have all detailed tutorials on the channel, so you can go ahead, get familiar, draft them from your own measurements and use those. You can also use any sort of sweater pattern that you already have in your collection. Perhaps you drafted it yourself, or maybe you purchased that, or you can also copy a sweater or even a loosely fitting t-shirt that you already have in your wardrobe and use that as a base. So many different ways and sort of like scenarios that you can use in order to arrive at the same destination. To get started, I will go ahead and copy my knit bodice block sweater onto a new piece of drafting paper, so that way we can easily make adjustments. And by the way, this is exactly the same pattern base that we used in order to create that really fun two-tone hoodie in season 1 of So Easy. So you see, one pattern, one bodice block, or one bodice block adjustment, and so many uses. Once this this is copied on a new piece of paper, let's go ahead and take a look at what fabric choices I have. I'm basically considering just a couple of options in these orange tones, but I wanted to show you a couple of other options so that way if you have something in your stash, you can kind of go through that and imagine how would that look in the shape and the form of a cardigan. So the first one, of course, is this burnt orange sweater knit. Now I might actually make a sweater out of this because I just love the feel and touch of it. However, it is a little bit too, I would say, too drapey for a cardigan perhaps. If I use stabilizer, that might help. However, some other sweater knits, like for example this one, you remember I did make a zero waist sweater from it and I have just a little bit extra left. This one does feel a little bit more stable than this one, so it just really depends on what kind of sweater knit you have. Next one is this one. This is my number one choice and it almost looks like a cable knit. Definitely very nice, very stable, and I think it's going to be gorgeous as this fall cardigan. But then of course you can also use fabrics like French terry, for example. I do have this sort of like an army green over here, and then if you remember, I had a couple of French terries that were with these sort of little sparkles on them, and of course an assortment of different really nice thick jerseys. And this particular one I believe is a wool jersey, also this really nice bright orange color. I think I have settled on this one for right now. So now let's go ahead and finish the pattern. When I work on projects like these, I also like to pull out buttons that I'm planning to use, so that way I have a reference point and when the project is done, it all looks really cohesive. Let's get started with the front and back pattern piece, and here I already have quite a bit of ease from a sweater modification of this knit bodice block, so I might add a little bit extra, but my first step is to turn the shoulder into a very slight drop shoulder. For that, I want to find approximately the midpoint of my shoulder seam, then take a straight line down and into the bottom half of the armhole. Here, I really would like to highlight that this is just one of the many ways how you can do these very simple adjustments. This is just the way that I like to do it, but I've shown you on the channel how to do it in a different way, so definitely choose and find what's right for you, as I always say. And now I want to pivot this and spread it just by about an inch over here, and that will give me that little drop shoulder. Now I just have to tidy up these lines a little bit and we'll be good to go. Let's see, let's go ahead and add a little bit of width over here. Let's start with just a 1/4 of an inch, and for that I'm just gonna add it over here and take a straight perpendicular line down all the way to the hem. Alright, so for now the front is done and we're going to repeat exactly the same adjustments on the back. Once these adjustments are done, I usually go ahead and double check that the shoulder seams match in length and that the side seams match in length as well. We will come back to the front pattern piece here in a second, but now let's take a look at the sleeve. Now, because I do have a drop shoulder in this cardigan, I also want to shorten the cap height. For that, I'm going to cut right here and to the both sides of the sleeve. Now I'm going to collapse the sleeve to achieve the result that I want. Now the original cap height was about 5.5 inches, so right now I'm aiming at about 3.5 inches, and that's why I have my ruler extended over here. Now here it's a little bit tricky because not only you need to collapse the sleeve, but also you need to take into the account the length of the armhole of the front and the back. Now because I'm working here with a knit bodice block and a slight drop shoulder, the length of the front and the back are actually the same, 9 inches each. So whenever I'm going to be working and reworking my sleeve, I just need to make sure that this curve and this curve after all of the modifications are still 9 inches each. Now, as you can see, I did deviate from the original plan. I did add a little bit extra here, about half an inch on top. And of course, I extended the width of the sleeve as well, because we did add here to the side seam of our cardigan. So now I'm just going to redraft the sides of the sleeve, and we're back to the front pattern piece. Now here I've decided to go with these buttons. I think these are going to fit really well with that nice burnt orange color. And the button itself is just about 1 inch wide. So I'm thinking a button placket down the center front that's then going to curve into the neckline is going to be really nice. And how about 2 inch wide? I think that would be a really nice width for this. So here's the piece for that little button placket. It's not nearly long enough as it should be. We're just going to use it as a template. So it's 2 inches wide, 1 inch on each side. And we know that this line over here is the center front. So in order for us to make a button placket on one side and on the other side, so that way they overlap really nicely, we need to subtract half of the width. So from the center front, I'm going to take 1 inch in and then a straight line. And now I also want to curve this in, and here it's better if you don't curve in as much, because once you cut out your pattern pieces, if you don't like the curve, you can always adjust it. So that's one of the reasons why I don't always cut the band right away. I actually construct the cardigan, and after I've done all of the adjustments, then I cut all of those pieces out. So here I think I'm going to leave the shoulder as is, because I want that band to come around and sort of create a little collar. And here, let's see. Let's curve it in something like this. The last thing to do is to cut off this piece that we don't need. And of course, don't forget the direction of this stretch, which is really important, especially when you're working with sweater knits and cable knits, because a lot of times they only stretch one way and very, very little, if at all, the other way. So the direction of the stretch and all of the pieces are going to go horizontally. And now let's cut the fabric. As I mentioned, I'm going to cut the front band, the band for the sleeve, and perhaps the bottom band as I construct my garment. Now, as you can see, the back is cut on the fold, and now we have 2 front pattern pieces cut mirrored and 2 sleeves cut mirrored as well. And as I was cutting, I also added a 1/4 inch seam allowance to all of the seams and hem allowance where it was needed, because as you know, I don't add either of those things to my pattern drafts, so I add them as I cut my fabric. Now, as for the sewing steps are really, really basic, and I do have an actual full sewing drafting tutorial for a nearly identical cardigan, so I will leave the link for it in the description of this video for you guys as a reference, because right now we're going to go through these steps rather quickly. First, I'm going to assemble the body of the cardigan. For that, I'm going to take the back pattern piece and both of the front pattern pieces, place them on right sides together, and I will sew the shoulder seams and the side seams. After that, I will take the sleeves and I will construct the sleeve seam on each one of them as well. Now, from my personal experience, sometimes it might be a little bit challenging working with sweater knits or any other knits of very similar consistency. So here are 3 quick and easy tips that you can do right here, right now, and I really hope that it will help you out. So first, if you're working on a serger like I am in this instance, you can change up your differential speed to see if that helps you with the waviness of the seams. Tip number 2 to help with the seams is to use a little piece of interfacing. Most of the times I use knit interfacing, but sometimes I use woven interfacing as well if I'm working with knits, just depending on what I have on hand and if I need that seam to stretch or not. You can also use a little bit of stabilizer, or perhaps you have some clear elastic. All 3 of these options, just right where the seam is at, will help not only stabilize the seam from stretching, but also make sure that it comes out nice and flat. Tip number 3 is that hand sewing, especially when you're working with knits, works magic. Like, for example, making sure that your seams lay flat and everything is nice and neat. Now the next step is to insert the sleeve, and because of the way that I started assembling this cardigan together, I'm going to be using the in the round method, but of course you can do a flat method as well. If you want to see what's the difference between one and the other, then I will leave some useful information for you as always in the description underneath this video. Alright, so we're almost done. So here I have to determine where the hem is going to be, and if I'm going to add a band on the bottom or if I'm going to simply fold in like this. And I am leaning towards folding it in just because I think that it's a really nice and neat way how to finish it, but you can of course do it with a band as well. You know, it's just a matter of preference in this particular case. So I think I'm going to fold it in like this, and now I have to take a measuring tape from the bottom all the way and to the center of the back neckline. Then of course we multiply that by 2 and we get the length of the center band. For the width, we have already determined that it's going to be 2 inches wide, but of course that is going to be double because the band is going to be on the fold on one side, plus adding a little bit of seam allowances to it as well. So here's one and here's the other one. You can of course cut your band all as one, but I do like having a center back seam because then I can curve it in and it sits a little bit better. Usually it is about 1 inch in the middle of the band on both sides. When sewn and folded, I find that it really gives better shaping at the back of the neck. The next step is to finish the other end of each one of the sides. For that, just simply go ahead, fold the band right sides together and sew the bottom edge. Now that that is done, I can start pinning the band to the front opening of the cardigan. And I like to start at the center back. Here conveniently on the band, now we have a center back seam, and then you just determine where's the center back of your cardigan, and I start pinning it from the center back down one side and again from the center back down the other side. Usually when I work with lighter fabrics and thinner fabrics, I like to attach the band and fold in the bottom hem all in one go. That way you complete the two, and when you turn everything right side out, it gives a really nice and clean result in that little intersection, just like you see on this little example. But here, this knit is definitely way too thick for that. So what I've decided to do is to attach the band first. As you can see here, the band is shorter than the cardigan itself, and that's because I haven't folded the hem in just yet. And now, using hand sewing stitches and a matching thread, I will attach that little piece of the bottom hem to the wrong side of the fabric. And I think that that really gives a really nice and clean result, and much cleaner than if I tried to do that on a serger and stretched it out. After I got done with those little corners, now I have to fold in the entire hem to the wrong side of the garment and secure it. And sometimes I like doing that by hand, sometimes I like doing that on a sewing machine, other times I like doing that on a cover stitch machine, and this time I decided to go for a cover stitch machine. But as I mentioned, you can do a variety of different techniques, just depends on what you have available and what you like to work with. As a last step, buttons and buttonholes, if that's something that you want on your cardigan. Now, neither one of my sewing machines wanted to do buttonholes on this really thick and stretchy knit, so of course I decided to do them by hand, and that was fairly easy. All I did was just a blanket stitch, really small, tiny, narrow blanket stitch twice in a round, so that way I make sure that the buttonhole will withstand all of that wear and tear. And now let's go ahead and take a look at the final result. I am really happy with the way this cardigan turned out, and I tried to style it in a few different ways with what I already had at home to show you that it can be a more relaxed option, a more put together option, but overall a really versatile piece in your wardrobe. So I'm really happy that this is now a new addition to my fall winter wardrobe. And here I actually have 2 more cardigans. So if you are a member of this channel, first of all, thank you so much for your support, and do tune in for this week's Members Extra, because we're going to take a look at all 3 cardigans together together. Now, one of these cardigans has a dolman sleeve, but overall quite similar to the orange cardigan that we just made. And the other one has a raglan sleeve. So in the members extra deep dive, we take a look at how are they different, how are they similar, and we also talk about some interesting details, like for example, this closure on the white cardigan. Next, following our weather forecast, we have this quilted vest, which is one of the most recent sewing makes. Now, vests are actually really versatile and they're great for layering. And depending on what fabric you make them from, you can make them for any season. Now, I'm sure you have seen this faux fur vest that my mom actually made for me more than 10 years ago, and I still wear it. It's lovely. You can make some really interesting combinations with it. But when it comes to today, I haven't decided yet if I'm going to be using fabric scraps from my vest, full yardage, or perhaps I could use this button-up shirt that I could upcycle as well. So I haven't made up my mind just yet. But another reason why we're talking about vests today is because they're really easy when it comes to pattern drafting. So I figure let's go ahead and get started on this first. To begin, as always, we will need to choose a base. Now in my case, I will be going for a bodice block with a dart. Now in your case, you can go for that as well, or perhaps if you don't have a bodice block, you can also go for a button-up shirt that has a slightly relaxed fit, or a blouse, for example. Just be mindful that in that case, your adjustments to the pattern are going to be different than mine. Here I have started by tracing the front and the back of my woven bodice block with dart on the new piece of tracing paper. And so that way you can see a little bit better, I am outlining it in black. And yes, to address the elephant in the room, I do have a pink finger. I was dyeing fabric and there was a hole in the glove on my pinky, so yep. And just a fun fact, the color of the fiber reactive dye is called hot hibiscus. It's actually exactly the same color as I used on this shirt, but this shirt I made years ago. Today I was dyeing a different type of fabric, but I thought, you know what, would be fun to match. Now let's get started with the adjustments. And first I want to shorten my bodice blocks, and I will do it on both the front and the back. Next, let's tackle the shoulder. I want to bring each shoulder up just about, let's say, a quarter of an inch or 1/8 of an inch. And then we're also going to open it up from both sides, from the neckline and the armhole. Now, a good thing to mention is that I will do a very quick mock-up after these adjustments are done. So that way, if there are any other design element or adjustments that I need to do, I can do them without fearing that something is going to go wrong once I cut my fabric. Next, I also want to lower the armhole. Let's start with 1/2 inch on both the front and the back, but of course you can take more or less if you'd like to. Now I am redrafting the armholes. Next, I want to add just a little bit at the side seam. Since my vest isn't going to be too puffy, let's do about 1/4 inch. And from here, I'm going to take a straight perpendicular line all the way down to the hem. On the front pattern piece, we're dealing with the dart. So in order to do that, just go ahead and fold in the dart like so. Bring it all the way up. You can also cut it and then bring it together, whichever way is better for you. Take 1/4 inch to the side and then do a straight perpendicular line all the way down to the hem, as we did on the back pattern piece. I think I want the top to be slightly curved. So I might just curve in this part over here, and I might do the same on the bottom hem. As you can see, all we did was open it up in a couple of areas like the armhole, the neckline, and the shoulder seam. We also added a little bit of width at the side seam. In my case, I made it shorter. In your case, you can go longer. If you are going longer, you will need to take in consideration your hip width, so keep that in mind. But other than that, this is good to go, so I will do a quick muslin. All of the patterns that I work on, I draft without seam allowances, so I'm cutting them out as is, and I'll be adding the seam allowances as I cut my muslin or my main fabric. After I cut out the patterns, I also double check if all of the seams match, especially if I'm working with a thick marker, and usually that is for video purposes because that can yield some minor indiscrepancies, but it can yield indiscrepancies. So that's why when I do drafting on my own time, I always use just a sharp pencil. I I have cut out my muslin and now I'm going to quickly baste it together on my sewing machine so that way we can take a look at what we have. Now this is how this mock-up looks on the mannequin, and most importantly, this is how it looks on me. Now a quick note to add here is that this pink shirt is made from exactly the same base that I use for majority of my blouses and button-up shirts. And it's great to have it on because this type of garment mostly is going to be the one that I'm going to be wearing with this vest when it's done. That way I can tailor it exactly the way I want it to fit on top of this shirt. For example, I think I want to open up the neckline here just a tiny bit more and make it a little bit rounder. I also think that I probably want to make it a little bit shorter, like this, and perhaps add a slit at the side seam or perhaps a little curve. I also might open up the front armhole just by a little bit. Let's say, I don't know, how much is there, like 1/4 of an inch? Maybe I'll go for 1/2 inch. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to do some sort of closures for my vest because right now it simply meets at the center front. But at this point, I'm taking off my muslin and I'm going to do all of the adjustments that we just discussed. Now let's try it on again. This is the new side, this is the old side. I like everything on the new side except one thing. Here at the neckline, I actually think I just want to sort of do a neckline like this one and curve it in over here. But other than that, I think we are ready to transfer all of the adjustments onto the pattern. This is going to be the final version of the pattern that I'm going to be using for the garment itself. So I need to transfer everything very carefully. And once I'm done, this is what I'm going to have for the front, and this is what I'm going to have for the back pattern piece. Now at this point the pattern is ready and we can finally get started on cutting the actual fabric. There's just one more thing that I want to add to my pattern. In your case you don't have to do it, but I'll explain why I want to do it. Now I want to add a layer of batting between the two fabrics of the outside and the inside of the vest, and that is going to create quite a thick layer, and I'm a little bit concerned about sewing all of these layers together at the shoulder seams and the side seams. So I thought about it, and I think what I want to do is I actually want to create an overlapping pattern pieces. So instead of sewing the pattern pieces together like this, we are going to overlap them. And for that, I need to add a little bit at the shoulder seam and a little bit at the side seam to create that overlap. To make this happen, first I have closed the dart on my front pattern piece. It just makes it easier to work with it. And then I'm going to add about an inch and a half extension to the side seam first, and then we will tidy up these edges, and we will do the same at the shoulder seam. Of course, don't forget that we will need to do this on the back pattern piece as well. Now, finally, I can give my fabric a really good press to prepare it for cutting, and I will be using this cotton linen blend for both the inside and the outside of my vest. As I mentioned before, I want to create a 3-layer sandwich with a cotton batting in the middle between the 2 layers of fabric. Now, because of that, instead of cutting out an actual pattern pieces out, I will be cutting out rectangles first that are big enough to fit those pattern pieces, because our first step is going to be to quilt it. To do that, I usually use a heat erasable pen or any other marking tool and my ruler, and then I mark diagonal lines so that way I know exactly where to quilt. After the lines are marked, I head to the sewing machine and start the actual quilting. In my case, I'm doing it just with a straight stitch, and usually I increase the stitch length so that way it goes a little bit smoother through all of the layers. Currently, I'm quilting the back pattern piece, which is pretty straightforward. For the front pattern piece, it's a little bit different because there I have a dart. Here I'm starting by marking the dart position on all 3 rectangles for one front pattern piece. After I have pinned the darts, let's sew them. Now when the dart is done, I will go ahead and press them. I will press one of them up, the other one down, and the dart on the batting, here we're actually going to cut it apart so that way we can press the seam allowances flat and reduce the bulk. After completing this, I'm going to place all 3 layers carefully together, making sure that they all align at the dart point and the dart end. After that, all of the steps are going to be the same as we did for the back pattern piece. So first I'm marking the quilting lines and then of course quilting it. Let me show you the final result on the pattern pieces with the darts. Once all of my rectangles are quilted, it is time to cut the actual pattern pieces out. And in my plan, I have decided that I'm going to finish the edges of this vest with bias tape. Therefore, I actually don't need to add any seam allowances at all, since at the shoulders and at the side seams, we're going to be using the overlap technique. So I'm just cutting out the pattern pieces as they are. Alright, now that we have cut all of the pattern pieces, let's go ahead and put them together. First, we're going to take our back pattern piece and one of the front pattern pieces. Here at the shoulder seams, I have marked the 1/2 inch extension line that we drafted on the pattern. Now we're going to place one on top of another, pin and sew right on the marked line. And here it is once it's sewn. Now we have to close up the raw edges, and I already completed one of the shoulders, so let me show you how it looks once done. It's really nice and neat from both sides. So to get that done, we will need to grab a piece of bias tape that's about 1 inch wide. Next, working from the right side of the garment, I will take the bias tape and place it on top, aligning it with the raw edge of one of the pattern pieces. And then I'm going to pin it and we're going to sew it. We're going to sew it through all of the layers, basically repeating the same stitch that we just did while overlapping the front and the back at the shoulder seam. It will look like this once done. Next, we need to trim the seam allowance just a little bit, flip the bias tape over the raw edge, and then stitch down again. Now to enclose the raw edge from the inside of the vest, all of the steps are going to be exactly the same. The only difference is that when you align the edge of the bias tape with the raw edge of the seam allowance, don't stitch through all of the layers, stitch just through the seam allowance itself, so that way that seam isn't showing on the right side of the garment. Once you flip over the seam allowance and enclose it, I also prefer stitching it down with hand sewing stitches for exactly the same reason, so that way it doesn't show on the right side of the garment. Now after the shoulder seams have been done from both sides, now it is time to finish up all of the other raw edges of this vest, also with bias tape. Now you can of course opt for buying bias tape from the store, but I really enjoy making my own. This time I decided to make it from white cotton poplin. I also didn't fold and press this bias tape. Instead, I left it as a strip, and I started by attaching it from the wrong side of the vest with about 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is quite a lengthy process because all of the raw edges from the neckline down the center front, side seams, armholes, and the back pattern piece, all of that needs to be done with bias tape. To finish this edge, now I need to pull the bias tape to the right side of the garment, tuck it under so that way all of the raw edges are enclosed evenly, and then give it a really good press. After that, pin and of course head back to the sewing machine to top stitch it from the right side. Alright, so all of the bias tape is attached. This is what we have so far. So now All we have to do is overlap the side seam. If you want to, you can pin it first and then try it on. Maybe you want to overlap it just a tad more, maybe just a tad less. So you can definitely do that. And as always, there's a couple of ways how you can do it. The first decision that we need to make is how to overlap. Front over back or back over front. And I think I will go for front over back. And then we need to measure the width of the overlap. In my case, it was about 1.5 inches. And then we can clip it or pin it. I'm choosing to clip because there's just so many layers. It's really hard to pin. Once that is done, the other decision that we need to make is how are we going to stitch it down. Option number 1 is to do it on a sewing machine on one side and on the other side. Option number 2 would be to do it entirely by hand. Option number 3 would be to do one side on a sewing machine, the side that's facing out, and to do the rest by hand. I think I like the option 3 the most, so that's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to stitch it down right here on the edge of this bias tape. The other side, as mentioned previously, I'm going to stitch down with hand sewing needle and thread. After this, the final thing is to attach a closure, for which I made a button and a loop from the same fabric as the vest itself. And that's it! Now let's take a look at the final result. I will say that in my book it's definitely a winner. It's simple, yet it looks good, it's practical, it's comfortable, plus it goes really well with a lot of things that I already have in my wardrobe, which is definitely something that I aim for whenever I make a new garment. Alright, let's imagine that we're moving closer to the springtime, and here I have the perfect little sewing mate for you. Easy to make and easy to wear, a little flutter sleeve blouse. Let me show you some of these floral fabrics. I haven't decided just yet which one I'm going to use, but these are the ones that I have picked for this project. 2 of these have a beautiful crinkle texture, but all 3 of them are blouse weight with a beautiful drape, which is essential for the type of sleeve that I'm going for. To get started on my pattern, I will go ahead and find my bodice block with a dart from my pattern binder. But in your case, if you don't have a bodice block, of course you can draft one. I have a full step-by-step tutorial. I will leave it for you guys in the description. But as always, I would like to encourage you to use what you already have on hand. So let's say you have a commercial pattern for a blouse or a dress that you absolutely love, you've made many times. You can take that and modify it. Or, on the other hand, if you have a blouse in your wardrobe that you absolutely love, you can also copy that and turn it into a pattern as well. So plenty of options. Choose the one that fits you best. I have copied my pattern blocks onto fresh pieces of pattern drafting paper, and we're going to start with the front. First, I want to do both, widen and deepen the neckline. Then I want to shorten the shoulder seam, but I want to bring the underarm section up, so that way when I wear this sleeve, which is quite open, you won't see my undergarments. I don't necessarily care for this bust dart, but I also want to make bottom a little bit flowier, so I'm going to use this bust dart in order to achieve that. Before I proceed with dart manipulation, I'm also going to lengthen this by about 2 inches. Now I'm going to cut this and this line. There it is. Now I'm going to shift it up in order to close the bust dart. And now it is going to give me that open and flowy design on the bottom that I'm going for. Very quickly fill in this space so that way it's easier for us to work with that. Then I have to connect these 2 pieces. One of the last things that I want to do is widen the side seam by about 1/4 inch or so, and then also straighten it out just a little bit. And that's it, we're done with the front pattern piece. Now it is time to do the adjustments on the back pattern piece, and here everything is so much simpler because the front pattern piece is going to serve us as a guide. First, I'm going to do the same as I did on the front, widen and deepen the neckline. And then I'm going to shorten the shoulder seam and bring the underarm section up. For the side seam, flare, and the bottom hem, I'm simply going to trace the front pattern piece. And that's it, the back pattern piece is done. One last thing that I want to do before I cut this out is to quickly double check that the length of the shoulder seams align on both the front and the back, and the side seam should match because we traced it from the front pattern piece. As a very final step, don't forget to include any necessary markings on your pattern pieces. Alright, so the bodice is done. Now we need to move on to the sleeve, and here we're going to use one of my favorite techniques, which is going to be a slash and spread method. As always, I'm starting by copying the pattern on a new piece of paper, and this is the sleeve that goes together with the bodice block that we just worked with. As you can see, I also made it a little shorter, and the adjustments that we're going to do are exactly the same as we did for the bodice block. And over the years of using this kind of sleeve, I've learned that it's pretty forgiving, so it's a little bonus. That's the reason I'm going to be pretty freehand with all of these adjustments. This is where the sleeve connects to the shoulder seam. There in the bodice block we shaved off a little bit, so here I'm going to come up a little bit and curve this line into the existing sleeve. This is where the sleeve connects to the side seam of the garment. We took it a little bit out, and I also brought the side seam a little bit higher up. So I'm going to do exactly the same, and again curve it in back into the existing sleeve. I have finished up by building out the side seams of the sleeve. Now we have to slash and spread it. Here I've marked little dots 1 inch apart, and now I'm going to do straight lines up for my slash marks. Now I will cut through all of these lines. Next, once all of the slashes are done, we're going to spread it evenly just like you see over here, but do it on top of another piece of paper because you will need to tape it down and then cut it out in order to achieve your new pattern piece for a sleeve. The center of the sleeve used to be this line that we cut apart and spread. So I've marked halfway point over here, and we're going to mark the new center of the sleeve, which is also going to be the grain line. Now all I have to do is trace around it and cut it out. Now that all of the pattern pieces are done, it is time to cut them out of fabric. And I think that I have settled on this beautiful floral rayon. It's already washed, so it is ready to go. As always, I draft my patterns without seam allowances, so I add them as I cut my fabric. While I'm getting this done, I wanted to take a moment and say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart to all of the members of the channel for all of your support. I truly appreciate you, and make sure to check out all of your members perks because we have members only mini series, early access videos, members extra deep dives like for example this jacket, and for these pants and many more. So definitely check out your members perks, make the most out of them, and again thank you so much. And if you're not sure what memberships are all about, you can always take a look in the description of this video. Now the fabric itself is quite delicate, so I want to start the entire process of sewing by stay stitching the neckline and the armholes. After I stay stitched my necklines, I realized, wait a second, I do have to have some sort of closure in the neckline so that way I can pull it over my head. So I did cut out a keyhole closure at the center back of my blouse and then finished it with a little piece of bias tape. Now as always, I do have detailed tutorials for all of these techniques, so I will leave them for you guys in the description of this video. Next on my list are shoulder seams, which are usually constructed by placing the front and the back right sides together. But in this case, I want to go for French seams, so the order of sewing is reversed. This is coming together very quickly, isn't it? It's because the design is very simple. Perhaps a little too simple for some because there's not a lot of bells and whistles. But you know, with years I have actually realized that sometimes you have to have a very simple, very clean design to let all of that beautiful print shine, because this is a very busy print and I love it, but you have to let it take the central stage. You have to let it sing at times. And I actually was inspired by the blouse that I'm wearing right now. This was actually one of the most recent upcycles that I did, and I am so glad that I did it because when I first made this top years ago, it was sleeveless and I really wasn't wearing it that much because of that. So I decided, you know what, let's just add a sleeve to it, and thank goodness I did have some fabric remnants, of course, because we do hold on to our special fabric remnants, don't we? So I had enough to cut 2 sleeves, and the sleeve is just a circle, but it has so much fun and so much movement. So I started wearing this blouse out when I completed the upcycle, and I couldn't believe how easy and effortless it is to wear it, yet you still feel put together. You still feel like you're wearing something nice. So the idea for a very simple, very clean blouse with florals and a little flutter sleeve came from this one. Next, I finished all of the side seams separately on the serger first because I had an impromptu idea of incorporating a little slit in the side seam. So instead of sewing the entire side seam with a straight stitch, I actually stopped about 3 inches above the hem and then pressed the entire seam open. Now to secure this little slit, I simply neatly top stitched around it. Now the hem on the bottom of the blouse is a simple double fold technique that I always love and do. After this, onto the sleeves. Here I have completed the first one to show you how it looks. The seam here is also a French seam and the hem is a narrow double fold technique. I know that this is a very small detail, but I really wanted to mention that I love how this orange thread works with the blue background of the fabric. Now once your French seam is done, it will be a little challenging to complete the hem, so to make it neater, I am reducing the bulk of the seam allowance. Now I can easily fold it in and complete the hem. Once the sleeves are done, I'm going to first baste them in by hand, and after that, sew them in with a straight stitch and complete the seam with a serger. Alrighty, the very last step is to finish the neckline. Now here, just like for the keyhole, I'm using handmade bias tape that is also going to become ties in the back. Alright, I think it's time to take a look at the final result. Here I made another impromptu addition of a little belt that I made from the same fabric. It gives this blouse extra versatility because now you can wear it 2 ways. To give you some extra ideas, I also wanted to show you this blouse that I made from exactly the same pattern using another fabric, and what a difference it makes and how it changes the overall feel of the garment. And we will talk about it more in the next Members Extra episode. So what do you think? I personally really love this simple design, and I hope that you will see beauty in this as well. Moving closer to the summertime, we have these adorable culotte shorts. Now here we actually have 2 videos for them. The first one is a full step-by-step tutorial on how to draft these, because these have been drafted from a circle, which makes it easy to do so even if it's your first drafting project. And then the second video will give you all of the necessary steps in order to sew them up. Now in my case, I went for a short version, but you can go midi length or even full length. It's definitely totally up to you. And I often say that once you understand the basics, once you understand the principle of how something works, then you can take it and create whatever you would like. And that's exactly my hope for today, to explore with you the principle of drafting a culotte, and from there, sky's the limit. Now I have oftentimes noticed that if we start with a geometric shape, it just makes it for a more logical and easier to understand process, at least for me. In fact, we have already done one culotte pattern draft on the channel. That time we used a rectangle, but this time we're going to be using a circle. Now, whether you start drafting your culottes from a rectangle or from a circle, they both share the same characteristics. One of them is that culottes have really long crotch extension. That's one of the reasons why when you look at culottes on the body, the front and the back kind of look like you're wearing a skirt. And that's the reason why a lot of times people will call them skirts. That long crotch extension is also responsible for a very particular fit of culottes, and that is that it sits away from the buttocks, which in return makes a very comfortable piece of clothing. So this is a great project for all skill levels, but also great for those who love the garments to look put together but still feel comfortable, like in my case. As you know, I'm not particularly into wearing skirts, but I feel that this strikes that really perfect balance. I'm going to unroll my pattern drafting paper and we're ready to start. We will need to have a couple of measurements, and first measurement is going to be our waist circumference. When measuring your waist circumference, which is a narrow area right around your belly button, if you have a piece of yarn or an elastic cord, go ahead and tie it around. You will find it useful for the next couple of steps. Now my full waist circumference is 29 inches, and whether you're working in inches or in centimeters, the steps are going to be absolutely the same. For starters, I need half of this amount, so 29 divided in half is going to be 14 and a half. Now the reason why I want only half of my waist circumference is because initially we're going to draft the back and the front pattern piece all as one, and therefore this measurement right over here equals to half of my waist circumference. Later on, if you would like, you can of course separate these pattern pieces into a separate front and separate back. Now this right over here is a 90-degree angle, and that's what we're going to start working with. Now, since I'm taking a circle as my basic geometric shape and 90 degrees is a quarter of 360, right now we're going to be building a quarter of a circle where this curved line is going to be equal to half of my waist circumference plus a little bit for ease. Now, you can of course use mathematic formula for that. In my case, I simply find 14 and a half, and let's say I'm going to add about a quarter for ease, and then I do this, and then I mark it. From the top of the angle all the way down to my mark is about 9 inches, and that is what I'm going to use in order to build out a segment of a circle. Now here's an interesting thing. The smaller is going to be the segment of the circle that you're going to take, the more it will resemble an A-line skirt. So if you do have an A-line skirt as a pattern that you love and that you have made before and you know that it fits great, you can also use that as a starting point for your culottes. And here is that curved line. Now, because I did use an approximate method instead of a formula, I am going to measure this curved line very carefully just to ensure that indeed it measures 14 and a half inches, which was half of my waist circumference, plus a quarter of an inch for ease. And it sure does. Now, if yours doesn't, let's say you need more, then you need to move this line a little bit lower. If you need less, then of course bring it a little closer. To ensure that your curved line is smooth and even all the way around, you can also bring the long ends together. Basically, you're dividing your 90-degree angle in half, and then you can see if you need to adjust. While we're at it, let's go ahead and determine the length of our garment. For that, take your measuring tape, place one end on your waist, and then drop it. From here, you can decide how long you want your culottes to be. For me, that is going to be 14 inches. Now we're going to use exactly the same principle to build out the second curved line, but instead of starting from here, we are going to start from our waist measurement. So place your measuring tape like so. This was that 45-degree angle line, and I'm going to mark here 14 inches, like this. Then I'm going to repeat the same thing right over here and right over here. Now you can see that we have the waist, and this is the hem. Before moving any further, I'm going to go ahead and cut this out. As you can see, it's starting to take shape. Next, we need to mark our body rise. This measurement is taken by sitting down straight on a very sturdy surface, and then take your ruler, place it on that sturdy surface, and then measure all the way up to your waist measurement. Once you have that, let's go ahead and mark it from the top here and from the top here. For this next step, I will need to add a little bit of paper on both sides, and we also need to determine where is going to be the front and where is the back. So let's say this is going to be front and this will be back. Now take your full hip circumference and divide it by 4, because from now on we're going to be working separately with the front and separately with the back. For me, quarter of my full hip circumference is 9.5 inches. So I want to take my measuring tape and I just want to double check from the point where we have marked body rise. I want to place my measuring tape And here I see that this is my quarter of full hip circumference, and this is how much extra I have on the front, and the same is going to be here on the back. So I know that there's plenty of ease for movement and flare. Once I have double checked that, I want to take this measurement, 9.5 inches, and divide that in half. So for me, that's going to be 4 3/4. And I want to place this measurement on the front and on the back in exactly the same way, with a 90-degree angle starting at the point of a body rise that we have marked earlier. Now currently, both of these measurements are exactly the same. Now for the back, we want to extend it by 5/8 of an inch. And for the front, we want to decrease it by 5/8 of an inch. So let's get that done. Now I want to take my body rise measurement and divide that in half on both sides and then mark it. From here, do a 1 by 1 inch square on the front and the back, so that way we can easily find a 45-degree angle. For the back, you're going to do 1 3/4 inches. Let me outline that in color so that way you can see. And for the front, you're going to do exactly the same, but just 1.5 inches. For the back, we're going to connect this point, and this point with a really nice smooth curved line. And for the front, we're going to do exactly the same. From the edge of the crotch extension, go ahead and take a straight perpendicular line down, which is equal to this measurement. Once done, let's go ahead and extend the hem. I will repeat the same on the front pattern piece as well. Now, a kind reminder here to remember that there are so many ways how to do this or that in sewing and pattern drafting, and this is just one of the ways. This is the way that I prefer to do it, and it works really well in my case. But I always encourage you to take what works for you, and then as always, figure out the rest. For a better fit, you might want to bring down the front a little bit, let's say by 3/8 of an inch to get started with, and if needed, you can take it even lower, and then blend it in. In the back, you want to do the opposite. You want to bring it up, let's say by 5/8 of an inch or more, depending on a preference. Now, before I finalize the pattern with a waistband, pocket, and a zipper fly, I am going to do a quick little muslin. Now, I draft my patterns without seam allowances, so you will need to add your seam allowances as you cut your fabric, just like you see right over here. Alright, so I actually made a couple of different muslins to show you the flare when you're using a half a circle skirt versus when you're using a quarter of a circle skirt. So that way you can see the clear visual and the difference between one and the other. Now first I want to show you the difference between the pattern drafts. This is a half a circle skirt culotte, and this one is a quarter skirt culotte. You can see the difference in the flare, the top part, and the overall shape of the culottes. As for the muslin, this is a half a circle skirt muslin, the one that we drafted together. And this is a quarter of a skirt culotte. Now let's do a side-by-side comparison so that way you can see the difference. Now, I personally like less flare in my culottes, so the ones that I made that you see right over here are quarter circle culottes. While I have my muslin on, right now is a great time to mark the side seam, which should divide the side of my leg in half and should be a straight perpendicular line to the floor. Here you can also determine if you want your culottes to sit a little bit lower than your waist, and if so, go ahead and mark that. After that, I took my muslin off and I transferred the marking of the new side seam onto my pattern. Then I decided that I like how my culotte sits on me, but I would like for this top part to be a waistband. So I decided that I will go ahead and draft 1.5 inch wide waistband from here to there. So I'm going to place 1.5 inch markings away, the same way that we did drafting this circle. And then I'm going to connect them. If you want to lower the placement of culottes on your body, you will follow exactly the same steps. From here, I also drafted a zipper fly, which is just about 1.5 inches wide, and it ends right here where the curve of the crotch starts. Then if you'd like, you can separate your pattern at the side seam and then add a pocket. Now I do have multiple different pocket tutorials step by step about drafting and sewing them, so I will leave them in the description of this video so that way you can choose the one that you like. Now here on the back pattern piece, you might experience that the hem over here in the back pulls up a little bit. So when you stand, the hem doesn't look even, but instead it goes like this. That is because it takes more length of the fabric to travel over the curve of the buttocks in the back than it does to travel over the front. In this case, you might want to lower the hem in the back by 1 inch here and here, but then very slowly blend it into the side seam. However, it is going to make this part longer, and this part needs to match the front pattern piece. So if you extend it here by 1 inch, you're going to need to decrease it right over here. Now from here, this pattern is good to be used as is. If I were you though, I would sew up a very quick muslin just to double check a couple of things, like for example, placement of the side seam and the length of the hem on the back pattern piece. But other than that, it's good to go. Now, as always, of course, you can finagle with the fit a little bit more. We're not going to be discussing these adjustments in this video, but if you are a member of this channel, definitely tune in for the Members Extra Deep Dive for this particular garment, and I will show you a couple of adjustments that you might want to include. And of course, I'll give you extra tips and tricks about the construction and certain choices that I have made, so definitely tune in for your members perks. And if you're not sure what memberships are all about, then definitely check them out in the description of this video. And I want to thank you so much for being a member. It truly makes a big difference. Well, there you have it. The pattern is drafted, which was hopefully pretty easy and pretty straightforward. And now all we have to do is sew it up. Now together, in a previous video, we drafted half a circle culottes. Here's a quick little muslin to demonstrate. But I personally prefer a quarter circle culottes, so that's what I'm going to be sewing today. However, whether you make a half a circle or a quarter circle culottes, the steps are going to be exactly the same. Here's my pattern, and as you can see, it is divided into a front and back pattern pieces. But if you'd like, you can leave it all as one and cut it as one pattern piece. I also have a pocket here situated in the side seam, but you can have any other type of pocket or no pocket whatsoever. It is totally up to you. The last part of this pattern is the waistband. Now, when it comes to supplies for this project, I have a zipper, a little bit of interfacing, buttons, thread, and of course fabric. For the outside, I will be using simple cotton, no stretch whatsoever, and the same but in solid for the lining, since my fabric is a little bit see-through in the light. Lining, of course, is optional and purely based on the fabric that you're using. Here I have washed, dried, and pressed my fabric, so I will start by cutting 2 front pattern pieces mirrored and 2 back pattern pieces mirrored as well. Now, I've noticed that some people find cutting pants a little bit confusing, ending up with 2 left legs and 2 right legs, and if that is so, no worries. I have a very detailed video for this topic, and I will leave the link for you in the description. Now, when it comes to the grain line of the pattern and where and how to place it when you're cutting your fabric, I was debating for the longest time about what would be the most logical solution in this particular situation, because we do have a lot of the edges that are cut off grain, and even more so when you're using culottes drafted from a half a circle. Now, I've decided in my case to place grain line parallel to the center front and parallel to the top part of the center back. The grain line of the pocket is going to mimic the grain line of the front pattern piece, and the grain line of the waistband is going to be right here at the center back where we're going to be cutting it on the fold. All my patterns I draft without seam allowances, so I add them as I cut my fabric. In my case, all seams except for the top and the bottom are going to be about 3/8 of an inch. For the top, I'm going to take 1/2 inch, and for the bottom, I'm gonna go for 1 inch hem allowance. You can of course set your own seam allowances, and you can also add them to your paper pattern before you start cutting your fabric. The first step personally for me before doing anything else is to apply small strips of interfacing on the seams that are likely to stretch out in order to prevent that. You can of course also do stay stitching. My interfacing over here is just a tad wider than a seam allowance itself, so that way when I stitch, the stitch will go through both the fabric and the interfacing. While at it, I also interfaced the zipper fly area on both front pattern pieces. After that, the next step for me is to finish the raw edge right over here. In my case, I did it on a serger, but you can of course use a tightly spaced zigzag stitch on your sewing machine or an overcast stitch as well. And then of course I completed the pocket. Here you can see that I cut one pocket bag out of the lining cotton and the other one out of self fabric, but you can also do both in self fabric as well. And here I also interfaced the edges of the pocket for extra stability. Now this is the same pocket as I made in this jacket. Here is just hiding under a flap, and the same pocket as I made in these green pants. I have a very detailed step-by-step tutorial how to assemble this pocket, and I will leave it for you in the description of this video. Now, one of the reasons why I decided to go for a pocket like this is because I did not want the pocket to interrupt anything on the front pattern piece. I want it to be as seamless, as clean as possible. And this is the perfect type of pocket for that because it's nearly invisible, but it's still there and still provides you with a little option to put something into your pants or shorts or a skirt. After the pocket is done, the next step for me is to take the front pattern piece and the back pattern piece and sew them at the side seam. Here's how it's going to look like when it's done. Then I'm also going to sew the inseam. First, let's go ahead and finish this raw edge, and this one as well. Now I'm going to grab my front pattern piece with already constructed pocket. I'm going to turn it this way. And I'm going to grab my back pattern piece and I'm going to place them right sides together, aligning them at the side seam. For my next step, I'm going to sew them together with a straight stitch. But the trick here is to make sure that you actually don't catch the opening of the pocket, so that way your pocket is actually functional. When you put your finger over here, you can clearly feel the opening of the pocket, so you can use that as the guideline as you're starting to sew. Or if you would like, you can use a heat erasable pen to mark the opening, or of course you can baste it as well, whichever way is easier for you. The point is to make sure that we don't catch the pocket. After I'm finished with the seam, I'm going to finish it with a serger. I'm back to my pressing mat because right now I'm going to lay my garment flat like this. And I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the back pattern piece and I'm going to press it. And now I'm going to top stitch the seam allowance towards the back pattern piece very close to the edge. While I'm at it, let's also place the inner leg seams of the front and the back pattern pieces together and sew them with your seam allowance and then press them open. Alright, at this point it is time to join the left and the right sides together. For that, choose a side that you're going to place just like so. And now go ahead and flip it so they're both looking the same direction. And you're going to place the side that is right side out inside of the one that's wrong side out. And first we're going to align them at the inner leg seam, and you can put a little pin in there. Then you want to find the center front and put a little pin in there as well. And then you want to find the center back and do the same. Now at first it might seem just a tad confusing, but once you have joined these three main points, you will see that your pants look like this. Now I'm going to join them at the crotch, but before I do that, I need to make a little mark. So first what I'm going to do is, from top right over here on the front pattern piece where the zipper is going to go, I'm going to use a basting stitch up until about right over here, just a little bit before the end of the zipper fly. And from there, I'm going to switch to a regular length stitch and continue all the way up to the center back. Now I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of installing a zipper because I do have a very detailed step-by-step with all of the visuals and everything else video on how to do this particular zipper. But I did want to give you an extra tip here regarding a zipper. If you have a chance, buy a zipper that's a little bit longer than what you actually need. This way you don't have to struggle around the zipper tab, and therefore your zipper and stitching around it is going to come out much nicer and neater. After the zipper is done, if you have a lining like me, it is time to assemble it. Now I have cut and prepared my lining just like the main pattern, minus the pockets and minus the zipper fly, and it is also a tad shorter at the hem.
Now I'm going to place the lining inside my culottes, wrong sides facing, and pin. First, I'm going to align it at the side seams and then at the center back. Now, to avoid having a ton of pins, I'm going to baste it together with a hand sewing needle and thread. Once done, now let's talk about a waistband. Here are two pieces of the waistband cut on the fold at the center back, and I also wanted to show you that I cut them a little bit longer at the center front, about 2 inches longer or so. The seam allowance for the waistband is going to be the same as the seam allowance for the waist seam on culottes. First step for the waistband would be to go ahead and stabilize it with an interfacing. So I know this is a little bit unorthodox, but the first thing that I did was I actually took the waistband, the one that was interfaced, and I pinned it in so that way I can determine how long I'm going to make it on each side. And then I marked it. These are the markings without any seam allowances. Now on one side I want my waistband to extend just as much as the zipper extends itself, and on the other side there's going to be a little overlap where the button is gonna go. So here you can always take a button, sort of estimate using that, and I've estimated that this much will be just enough. I'm also going to make a marking over here. I'm going to write that this is where the button is gonna go, and so that way I know which side is which. Now I'm going to unpin my waistband, and we're going to make a couple of other little minor adjustments. Now this is what I'm going to do next. I'm working on a side with the button first, so with the overlap. This was the marking without any seam allowances, so I want to extend by 3/8 of an inch. That is going to be my seam allowance, and then I want to extend it by another 3/8 of an inch because I want to create a little overlap on the back side. You will see what I mean here in a second. Once I've done that, let's go ahead and we can trim the excess off. Now let's do that on the other side. Again, this is the marking without any seam allowances, so I want to extend it by 3/8 of an inch because that is going to be the seam allowance, and then by another 3/8 of an inch. So I'm marking my seam allowance here, and then another 3/8 of an inch. And now I can cut off the excess. Now I have placed one waistband on top of another, wrong sides together, aligning at the center back. And of course their length doesn't match because I have just shortened the one that was interfaced. And the one on the bottom I actually want to make 3/8 of an inch shorter. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the excess, and then I also have to measure 3/8 of an inch away from the edge and cut that off as well, like this. And I'm going to repeat exactly the same step on the other side as well. Now the waistband that's on the bottom is 3/8 of an inch shorter than the waistband that's on top on both sides. Before I move on to the next step, what I want to do is right here on the bottom edge of the waistband that wasn't interfaced, I want to do a straight stitch all the way from one side to the other. So that way I have a guide for pressing that edge of the waistband to the wrong side. I've stitched this line about 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, which was smaller than the seam allowance. So that way I have a little bit of the lip on the other side of the waistband when stitching it in a ditch. And a quick reminder that this is just how I go about this. You can do it any other way. There are so many different techniques when it comes to sewing. As always, find what works for you, and you're free to do whatever is best in your particular circumstance for your project. Once that is done, I'm actually going to sew the short ends of the waistbands together first. So I'm going to place them like so and sew them with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on both sides. The short ends of the waistbands are done, so now I'm going to align both waistbands at their center back where I have made my little notches, and you can see this is what's happening to the end of the waistband, so that's exactly what we wanted. So now I'm going to go ahead and press it like so on both sides. After this, I can go ahead and sew the top of the waistband with the seam allowance that you have chosen. After sewing the top of the waistband, while I was still at the sewing machine, I also went ahead and understitched the seam allowance to the wrong side of it. And after that, I gave it one more really good press to make sure that it's ready to be inserted. Alright, now it's time to pin it in. First, of course, I aligned the center back of the waistband and the center back of my culottes. And then I'm going to pin only the waistband that is interfaced, so the one that's a little bit longer. And I'm going to pin it all the way to one side and all the way to the other side. After pinning this first layer of waistband, of course, I'm going to sew it with a straight stitch and attach it to the main body of the culottes. All right, I'm on the finishing line. Now I want to go ahead and snip these zipper ends, and I want to tuck the seam allowance upwards towards the actual waistband. I also find that this is the fiddliest part of this entire project, so it may take a little while to get that waistband in there nice and flat. And from the wrong side, from the inside of the project, this is what you're going to have. And then we're going to stitch it down from the right side of the garment, and we're going to stitch in a ditch. Once the waistband is in, you will of course attach your button, and if you're using any hook and eye closures as well. Now in this project there are two parts where I'm using hand sewing stitches. The first one is attaching the lining to the zipper, and the second one is finishing this little part of the waistband. After that, all you have to do is finish the hem. The hem of the lining in my case was finished just with a simple double fold hem, and the hem on the culottes itself was finished with a blind stitch. And that's it. Give your culottes another really great press and you're ready to rock them.
Using these circle culottes as a base, I also made these little shorts that were actually upcycled from a men's button-up shirt. So if you want to see how I did that, I will leave the link for that video in the description. And rolling all the way into the summertime, let's make a swimsuit cover-up. As you can see, you can wear it two ways. One of them is on your waist as a skirt, the other one is above your bust. So it's definitely up to you. But apart from fabric, the pom-poms, which if you'd like, you can skip or opt for a different type of trim, you will also need elastic. Now in terms of how much fabric you will need, first you're going to determine the length. So this is about a yard. For you it might be a different measurement, and add a couple of inches extra to it to account for hemming and of course folding under for the elastic. Now when it comes to the width of the fabric, we're going to use somewhat of a similar principle as we do for a gathered waist skirt. So we're going to take the width that is definitely bigger than our waist because we're going to be gathering the fabric. There's another way how you can determine it. You can take your elastic, place it around your waist, and cut it so that way you can meet the ends of the elastic comfortably, like so. Then grab your piece of fabric and determine the comfortable width of your elastic, the realistic width of your elastic that it can stretch to. Once you have determined that, place your fingers here on the fabric and you can mark that placement. Anything that's extra, you can cut it off. My elastic is about 25 inches long. My actual waist is about 29 inches. Now here I find that the particular technique that we're going to be using does stretch out elastic a little bit extra in the process. So I usually snip off another inch or two from those 25 inches that I mentioned. And then I'm going to cut my fabric to be about 40 inches wide. Now, of course, don't forget that these are my personal measurements and you will be using measurements that work for you. As far as the fabric suggestions, I would personally go for something flowy and light. I will leave a list of suggested fabrics for you in the description of this video. Now make sure that you save that little piece that we have cut off because we're going to use it for the ties. But right now we need to tidy up the bottom of our rectangle and curve it in because that's where we're going to apply our pom-poms. As you can see, my hem here is all sorts of interesting. So first I'm actually going to cut it straight and even it out. Now here at the corner, I'm going to curve it in. If you're a little bit hesitant to cut a curve, I totally get you. You can use a large round plate or a pot in order to help you with that and trace around it. I'm going to start the entire sewing process by finishing the hem first. This is the right side of my skirt, one of the top corners. I'm going to take my pom-poms, place it so that way they are right on the edge of the fabric, like so. And now I'm going to stitch it down with a wide zigzag stitch.
All right, once all of the pom-poms are attached, let me show you, here they are. Now we have to do a second pass where we're going to fold this under like so and then stitch with a straight stitch on the right side of the fabric, catching the other side, making sure that it lays flat. Alright, now the entire hem is done. Now let's do the top and the ties. For that, I have cut 2 rectangles. This is how it's going to look like when it's all done, and this is how it looks before we put it together. It's about 16 inches by 3.5. Then we're going to place it right sides together and stitch it along the long end and one of the short ends. Once it is stitched, I'm going to turn it right side out and give it a really good press. Once that is done, as mentioned, we're going to top stitch all the way around on all 3 sides. Now I have 2 pieces for the ties. Now I'm going to grab my elastic and my ties and we're going to join them together. And we're going to place them like this at the ends and zigzag it, and we're going to repeat it on both sides. Here I'm going over this part with a zigzag quite a few times to ensure that this is nice and secure. Once done, now we're ready to move on to the last and final part of this project, which is going to be installing the elastic. To ensure even distribution of elastic and gathers, first I want to mark halfway point of my elastic, folded in half, and the same on my skirt. Now I can open this up as well as the elastic and place these right sides together, making sure that this connection with the clean side is facing the clean side of the skirt, and then pin it right here. Now I'm going to take one end of the skirt and place it right here, just a little bit further away from the end of the elastic, and again pin it, and I'm going to repeat the same thing on the other side. Stretching elastic as I sew, I'm going to attach the top part of the skirt to the elastic with a zigzag stitch. I start by securing the thread without stretching the elastic just yet. Once I'm done with the back stitching, then I use one of the ties in order to stretch the elastic evenly as I zigzag it. When done, this is what you're going to have. Now let's turn the elastic like so, and we're going to stitch it down a few more times just with a straight stitch in each one of these little rows of my elastic. And we're going to do that exactly the same way as we did with the zigzag one, stretching the elastic as we sew. The first row is usually the hardest one, but with each following row it's going to get easier and easier, and you will see how that beautiful stitching of the elastic gets formed. After completing 4th and final row, my project is done, so now let's take a look at the final result. And by the way, from the little piece of fabric that was left over, I made 2 little scrunchies. So that's it. The fabric is gone. Now, if you want to see how to draft and how to sew a top that I'm wearing right now, then click on the video right over here. I'll guide you through the steps so that way you are all ready for summer. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy, thoughtful sewing. Bye!